How much does the situation with voters change in the last weeks before the elections?
It all depends on events that could be beyond the candidate's control. The one thing that we know will be very much within the control of the respective candidates is their performance at the upcoming debate. And of course, Donald Trump is a tested debater. He basically knocked Joe Biden out of the presidential race several months ago and swept through all of his Republican opponents in 2015 and 2016 to become the nominee. Whereas Kamala Harris is considered highly untested. She failed to win any primary votes when she ran for president in 2020. And as we know, she's had a very highly controlled presidential campaign since becoming the party's candidate in mid-July. But beyond the debate, first of all, the good news for Donald Trump, of course, is that his sentencing on September 18th has now been postponed until after the election because there was a very real possibility that Donald Trump would have been placed in jail on September 18th. He would have been sentenced in jail. So now that's not going to affect the presidential campaign season. And then there are forces beyond anyone's control. You could have markets crash. You could have something serious happening, say, in the Middle East, or the Russia-Ukraine war, or China against Taiwan, or Japan, or its South China Sea neighbors. Any number of things can be happening along those lines. And so it remains to be seen what effects that will have on voters. But please also keep in mind that in the United States, we no longer have an election day. We have an election season. And so ballots are being submitted starting the middle of September. And so there will be votes counted. And once those votes are in, if there is something that takes place after the debate or an international incident or something with the economy, those votes are already cast and cannot be changed. So it's a very different dynamic here than we're accustomed to in most democratic countries.
So, according to the latest estimators, Kamala Harris have a small advantage. Did Donald Trump intensify his campaign before the American elections because of this?
Well, our best understanding, and polls are a window into voter sentiment. They don't tell us anything about what will actually take place on election day, of course, but it gives you a sense of the trends and directions of the various candidates and their messages and their appeal to voters. Kamala Harris is winning in the national polls largely because most Democrats tend to lead in national polls overall because of the impact of the large city populations, which tend to overwhelm rural and suburban populations. And especially in a state like California, where you could have 6 million more Democrat voters than Republican voters, that completely tilts national polling. But of course, in the United States, it's irrelevant. The only thing that matters is how many states you win. So the Electoral College remains very, very tight, despite the national poll lead that Kamala Harris may enjoy. And we know, of course, we've seen in regular election cycles, especially in 2016 and in 2020, that essentially a handful of states, 6 to 8 states, maybe 15 to 25 counties in those states, a mere tens of thousands of voters in each of those states will ultimately decide who is the next president of the United States.
So, what can global politics actually? How can global politics be changed after the elections in America, and what does Europe expect?
I would say, for the most part, if Kamala Harris is elected president, you will probably have general continuity with the Biden administration's foreign policy, which is largely a matter of continuity from the Obama foreign policy of 2009 to 2016. Maybe you'll see a little bit of a different tack in the Middle East, where Kamala Harris may be more sympathetic to the hard left radical progressives in the Democratic Party, who are much more sympathetic to Hamas and to the Palestinian cause. And you may see a greater rupture in U.S.-Israeli relations. But I think for the most part, we'll see efforts to continue the military aid to Ukraine, as Joe Biden has sought to achieve. We'll probably see a continuation of trade restrictions on China involving technology and the like. Now, if Donald Trump is elected president, I think you'll see a sea change in foreign policy and international security, probably a much tougher stance, not only against the Communist Party of China, but also, I would say, against Taiwan, that Taiwan needs to step up its defense and become a mini Israel or a mini Poland and spend 5 to 10% of GDP to defend itself if Taiwan ever expects the U.S. to come to Taiwan's defense. I think you'll see a resumption of the most severe sanctions against Iran and probably an effort to bring Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates together and to better arm those countries to be able to deal with Iran themselves, to free up the U.S. to deal with the Communist Party of China. And in Europe, Donald Trump has been very clear that he intends to make an offer to Vladimir Putin to come to the negotiating table to achieve a peace settlement. And if Putin does not, he will arm Ukraine to the teeth, but at the same time communicate to President Zelensky that if Zelensky does not come to the negotiating table, he will deny any further aid to Ukraine, thereby forcing both parties to come to the table and hopefully achieve some type of a peace settlement. And I would say, lastly, on the strategic level, you will probably see a relaxation of many of the regulatory restrictions against the production of hydrocarbons in the United States, so that America, which is already the world's leading oil and natural gas producing superpower and exporter, will flood global markets with oil, with natural gas, lowering the prices and giving the U.S. far more leverage, especially in the Middle East, but also helping our allies in Europe and Asia that are dealing with the energy crunch and energy scarcity ever since the sanctions were levied against Russia for invading Ukraine.
So, are there any kind of divisions in within the parties themselves before the elections, or do they act in unity?
I would say, first, let's talk foreign policy. You're probably seeing a rift inside the Republican Party between the traditional foreign policy establishment that is almost obsessively anti-Russia, reflexively anti-Russia, and wants to continue to arm Ukraine for, as Joe Biden would say, for as long as it takes, without ever defining what it means, what the exit strategy looks like. And in the meantime, we're seeing hundreds of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians being killed, and the Ukrainian economy and infrastructure being destroyed day by day by the Russian military. And then you have a new generation of Republicans that has tired of this kind of American intervention in foreign wars and wants to reserve the American military only for the most essential sort of homeland security and allied defense needs. And keep in mind, Ukraine is not a NATO ally of the United States, the way most of Western Europe or countries like Japan and South Korea are. So I think you're seeing a rift there. And on the Democratic Party, like I mentioned before with Kamala Harris, you see the traditional Democrats that are very pro-Israel, and you have this sort of squad coalition of hard left radical progressives that are not just pro-Hamas and very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but almost seem to have forgotten what it was, what horrible acts of terror and rape and murder and mayhem were committed by Hamas against Israel to trigger this war against Gaza. And now we have this wider war with Hezbollah and Iranian proxies, the Houthis against the shipping in the Red Sea, and Iraqi and Syrian presence of Iranian militia against Israel. So I think you'll see a greater rift inside the Democratic Party over U.S.-Israel relations. And I would say on the domestic front, I think you're going to see more of a divide in the Republican Party about abortion. Ever since abortion was returned to the states, you've had the sort of harder pro-life movement that wants almost a national laws banning abortion across the country, or more stringent laws. And then you have Republicans who say, well, most of America does not want very severe abortion laws, at least not to that degree. And if we don't win elections, we can't do good things on all the other issues, socially, economically, and in foreign policy. So there's the moral dimension and the practical dimension of the abortion debate. And I would say in the Democratic Party, to close, that the transgender movement is going to rupture the Democratic Party because it is seen as an element of the so-called LGBT movement, but it is completely destroying women's sports and invading the spaces of women. where they deserve to have sanctity and privacy and safety. And the idea that there are Democrats that don't mind men being in exclusively female spaces is going to cause great, great problems within the Democratic Party.
And is this a fair race for the president of America in terms of the media and the campaign itself?
No, very simply. It's a known fact. I mean, this is not an opinion. It's a known fact that most reporters in legacy or establishment or corporate media are inordinately sympathetic to the Democratic Party, to liberals, to leftist organizations, very hostile towards conservative organizations, and extraordinarily hostile towards Donald Trump the man. But I think if you look back at recent presidential elections, anytime there was a so-called acceptable Republican, like a Mitt Romney or a John McCain, once that individual was the Republican candidate for president, they were made to be evil incarnate. And, you know, you're talking about generally decent people. Mitt Romney is supposed to be one of the most decent people in American politics, and they made him out to be one of the most hateful villains in recent American politics. And, of course, Donald Trump is likened to Adolf Hitler incessantly. So, no, the coverage is extraordinarily unfair to Donald Trump, the individual, the Republican Party in general, and certainly to conservative ideas. But the Republican Party knows how to win races in this extraordinarily hostile environment. And now, especially with the rise of independent media, podcasts such as yours, and thousands of podcasters and social media outlets available to compete in terms of distributing information about candidates, about political movements to the American people, and frankly, to people around the world, free speech is maybe more important than ever against the kind of very tilted media perspectives, at least here in the United States. I can't speak for every other country. It is a problem here, but I think that they have already baked it into their equation as to how to compete against the media to communicate their messages to voters.
One more question. Does it mean that we can expect after the elections some kind of riots or something, or protests?
That's an area that we are very uncomfortable talking about, but very frankly, we saw what happened in the summer of 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement that incinerated the downtowns of a number of cities in the United States with impunity. Almost no law enforcement was ever used against those rioters that burned down federal courthouses and police stations and caused billions of dollars in damage and murdered several dozen Americans in that horrible summer of 2020. I can tell you anecdotally that in November of 2020, most shops in downtown Washington, D.C., where my office is located, were boarded up in fear that if Donald Trump were elected in 2020, that we would have a similar outbreak of riots in Washington, D.C., and perhaps other major cities. We're hoping that we don't see that and that we can have peaceful, free, open, honest, and fair elections, and that the more free and open and honest the elections are, the more the American people will accept whatever the outcome is. But the fear is very much that the hard left will never accept a Donald Trump presidency again. And so the fear, I think, is very real that if Donald Trump is somehow elected president in November, that you will have riots that will probably rage for weeks in cities across the United States, whereas if Kamala Harris wins in what is seen as an honest election, conservatives tend to go to work the next day and mind their own business.
Thank you very much for your time.